I stood on my grandmother's old dock, watching Karen Matthews march toward me with a folder full of papers and 3 HOA board members trailing behind her like obedient puppies. The morning mist was still rising from the lake, and I was holding my coffee cup so tight my knuckles had turned white. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice cutting through the peaceful silence like a rusty blade. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, or we will have the sheriff remove you." I looked at her perfectly manicured nails tapping against that folder. I looked at the smug expressions on the board members' faces. I looked at my sanctuary, the place where my grandmother had taught me to fish, where I had scattered her ashes just 2 years ago. That was when I realized something that would change everything. Something that would wipe that satisfied smile right off Corinne's face forever. 3 months earlier, I had been living what I thought was a simple life. Every Friday evening, I would drive the 2 hours from the city to my grandmother's lake cabin. It was not much to look at from the outside. The paint was weathered, the dock needed some repairs, and the garden had grown wild in the year since Grandma Rose had passed away. But to me, it was perfect. I would wake up at sunrise, make coffee in her old percolator, and sit on the dock watching the water lap against the wooden posts. The silence was medicine for my soul after a week of corporate meetings and city noise. This was my sanctuary, my connection to the woman who had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. The first time I met Corinne Matthews, I was replacing a loose board on the dock. She appeared at the edge of my property like a storm cloud rolling in on a sunny day. She was wearing a crisp white blouse and dark slacks, carrying a leather portfolio like she was conducting business. "Are you the new owner?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made my skin crawl. "I am," I said, wiping sawdust off my hands. "I inherited the cabin from my grandmother." "Well, there are rules here," she said, opening her portfolio. "This is a planned community with standards to maintain. I am Karen Matthews, president of the Lakeside Homeowners Association." She handed me a thick packet of papers. "These are the community guidelines. You will need to repaint the cabin within 60 days. The color must be approved by the architectural committee. Your dock needs to be rebuilt to current specifications, and that garden needs to be professionally landscaped." I looked at the papers, then at her, then back at the papers. My grandmother lived here for 30 years. She never mentioned any HOA. "Things change," Corinne said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "The association was formed 5 years ago to protect property values. Everyone must comply." Over the next few weeks, the citations started arriving. The mailbox was the wrong color. The cabin needed new shutters. The dock was not regulation height. The garden violated the landscaping standards. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine grew larger when I did not immediately comply. I tried to be reasonable. I painted the mailbox. I trimmed the garden. I even bought new shutters, though it nearly broke my heart to remove the hand-carved ones my grandfather had made in 1962. But nothing was ever good enough for Corinne. She would drive by every few days finding new violations. The dock was too old. The cabin needed vinyl siding. The trees were too tall. The gravel driveway should be paved. Each time she visited, her tone grew more hostile. Each citation became more personal. It was as if she had declared war on my family's legacy, and I was losing every battle. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning when I found the certified letter taped to my door. It was an official eviction notice, signed by the entire HOA board. I had 30 days to vacate the premises for failure to comply with community standards. I sat on my grandmother's porch, holding that letter, and for the first time since her funeral I cried, not just from sadness but from rage. This was not just about property. This was about erasing the last piece of my family, the last connection to the woman who had loved me unconditionally. But as I sat there, something shifted inside me. The tears dried, and a cold determination took their place. I was not going to let Karen Matthews steal my grandmother's legacy. I was going to fight back. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to the county courthouse. If Karen wanted to play legal games, I would learn the rules better than she ever had. I spent the entire day in the records office, pulling every document related to my property and the Lakeside Homeowners Association. The first thing I discovered was that the HOA had been incorporated in 2019, just 5 years ago. But my grandmother had owned her property since 1994. How could an association formed 25 years later have authority over property that predated it? I dug deeper into the incorporation documents. The HOA claimed authority over 43 properties around the lake, including mine, but the legal descriptions were vague, and several property boundaries seemed to overlap in ways that made no sense. The meeting minutes were even more interesting. Karen had been president since the association's formation, and the same 5 board members had been in power the entire time. They met monthly, usually approving whatever Karen proposed without discussion. But the most recent minutes showed a disturbing pattern. 3 families had been forced to sell their properties in the past 2 years due to HOA violations and mounting fines. All 3 sales had been handled by the same real estate company. All 3 properties had been purchased by the same development corporation. I wrote down the name, Lakeside Development LLC. That afternoon, I drove to the other end of the lake to visit Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman I had met at my grandmother's funeral. She had lived on the lake longer than anyone, and her memory was sharp as a tack. "Oh, honey," she said, pouring sweet tea on her back porch. "That Karen Matthews has been nothing but trouble since she moved here. Her husband owns a construction company, you know. They have been eyeing all the old properties for years." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, the lake is perfect for luxury development. Big houses, boat slips, maybe even a resort. But all us old-timers with our little cabins are in the way. The HOA has been finding ways to force people out, one by one." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, lowering her voice. "My neighbor, the Johnsons, they got cited for everything under the sun. Tree too tall, driveway too narrow, house too old. The fines kept adding up until they could not afford to fight anymore. Had to sell for half what the property was worth." "Who bought it?" "Some corporation. Within a month, the old cabin was bulldozed and they started building a 5,000-square-foot house. Funny thing, though, Karen and her husband moved in the next week." My blood began to boil. "You are saying Karen is using the HOA to force people out so her husband can buy the properties cheap?" "I cannot prove it," Mrs. Henderson said, "but I can count. 3 families forced out, 3 properties sold cheap, 3 new luxury houses built, and Karen's husband's construction company did all the work." I drove home that night with my mind racing. This was not about community standards or property values. This was about greed, pure and simple. Karen was using her position as HOA president to systematically steal people's homes. But I still needed proof, and I needed to understand exactly what legal authority the HOA actually had over my property. The next morning, I went back to the courthouse, this time focusing on the original property deeds. I pulled every document going back to the 1940s, when the lake was first developed as a summer retreat for city families. What I found changed everything. The original plat map showed my grandmother's property as a single large parcel that included not just the cabin, but the entire shoreline and the community boat dock. Over the years, pieces had been sold off to other families, but the dock and a strip of lakefront property had remained with the original parcel. I stared at the deed, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood. My grandmother had not just owned a cabin. She had owned the entire lakefront. The other families had easement rights to use the dock and access the water, but they did not own the land itself. Which meant I did not just own a cabin. I owned the land under every house around the lake. I owned the community dock. I owned the boat launch. I owned the swimming area. Karen Matthews was not just harassing me. She was harassing the actual owner of the property her entire community was built on. I sat in my car outside the courthouse, holding those deeds, and for the first time in months, I smiled. Karen wanted to play games with property rights and legal authority. She had no idea what she had started. Armed with the original property deeds, I spent the next week researching every aspect of the HOA's formation and operations. What I discovered was a web of corruption that went far deeper than I had imagined. The incorporation documents for the HOA contained a critical flaw. The association claimed authority over properties that were never legally included in the community. My grandmother's property, along with several others, had been listed as part of the HOA without the owner's knowledge or consent. But the most damning evidence came from cross-referencing the HOA board members with local business records. Karen's husband, Robert Matthews, was the sole owner of Lakeside Development, LLC, the company that had been buying up the properties from families forced out by HOA violations. The pattern was clear and systematic. Karen would target a property with excessive violations and mounting fines. The family would eventually give up and sell to avoid bankruptcy. Lakeside Development would buy the property at a fraction of its market value. Within months, the old cabin would be demolished and replaced with a luxury home worth 3 times the purchase price. But there was more. Robert Matthews also owned Heritage Construction, the company that had built all the new luxury homes. He was profiting on both ends of the scheme, buying properties cheap, and then charging premium prices to build new houses. I dug deeper into the financial records. The HOA's annual budgets showed suspicious patterns. Large consulting fees paid to companies that did not seem to exist. Legal expenses that were far higher than a small community association should need. Property maintenance costs that were charged to the association, but seemed to benefit only the board members' properties. The most shocking discovery came when I found the original easement agreements from the 1970s. My grandmother had granted specific rights to the neighboring families to use the dock and access the lake. But these were revocable easements, not permanent property rights, and they had never been transferred to an HOA. In legal terms, the Lakeside Homeowners Association had no authority over my property whatsoever. They were not just overstepping their bounds. They were operating completely outside the law. But Karen's motivation became clear when I found the development plans filed with the county planning office. Robert Matthews had submitted preliminary designs for a luxury resort and marina complex. The plans showed the existing cabins demolished and replaced with a 40-room boutique hotel, spa, and marina. The project was worth millions, but it required control of the entire lakefront, including my property. I realized that everything Karen had done was designed to force me out so her husband could complete his development project. The harassment, the violations, the eviction notice. It was all part of a systematic plan to steal my family's land. That night, I called my grandmother's old attorney, a man named James Sullivan who had handled her estate. I explained what I had discovered, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Your grandmother suspected something like this might happen," he said finally. "She was very specific about preserving the property rights and the easement agreements. She wanted to make sure no one could ever force you out." "What do you mean?" "She recorded additional documents with the county just before she died, affidavits detailing the original property boundaries and the specific terms of the easements. She also included a revocation clause that would allow you to terminate all easement agreements if the property was ever threatened." I felt my heart pound. "You mean I could shut down their access to the lake?" "More than that," Sullivan said. "You could shut down the entire community. Without easement rights, none of the other properties have legal access to the water. Their boat docks, their swimming areas, their property values, everything depends on easements that you control." I sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what he was telling me. Karen thought she was forcing me out to clear the way for her husband's development, but she had actually been threatening the one person who could destroy their entire scheme. "There is something else," Sullivan continued. "I had my suspicions about the HOA's formation, so I did some research of my own. The association was incorporated using forged documents. Several property owners never consented to joining, and their signatures on the incorporation papers are fake." "Can you prove that?" "I have handwriting samples from your grandmother's estate documents. The signature on the HOA incorporation is not hers, and if one signature is forged, the entire incorporation is invalid." I hung up the phone and walked out to the dock. The moon was full, casting silver light across the water. For the first time in months, I felt completely calm. Karen Matthews had declared war on the wrong person. She wanted to play games with property rights and legal authority, but she had no idea that she was threatening someone who actually owned the land her entire community was built on. Tomorrow, I would begin my counterattack, and when I was finished, Karen would understand what it really meant to lose everything. The next morning, I woke to the sound of someone banging on my door. I looked out the window and saw Karen standing on my porch with two men I did not recognize. One was carrying a clipboard and the other had a camera. "We are here for the final property inspection," Karen announced when I opened the door. "These are county code enforcement officers." I looked at the men more closely. They were not wearing county uniforms or badges. "Can I see your identification?" "We do not need to show you anything," the man with the clipboard said. "We have authority to inspect any property in violation of community standards." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "Actually, you have no authority to inspect my property without a warrant, and you are not county officials." Karen's face flushed red. "You have 48 hours to vacate these premises. If you refuse, we will have the sheriff remove you." "On what grounds?" I asked calmly. "Failure to comply with community standards. Accumulation of fines totaling over $15,000. Violation of HOA covenants and restrictions." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Karen, can you tell me exactly what authority the Lakeside Homeowners Association has over my property?" She hesitated, glancing at the two men. "We are the legal governing body for this community. Everyone living here is subject to our rules and regulations." "And when did my grandmother agree to join this association?" "When she bought the property, she automatically became a member." But my grandmother bought her property in 1994. The HOA was not formed until 2019. How could she have agreed to join an association that did not exist for 25 years? Karen's confident expression began to crack. The association has retroactive authority over all properties in the community. According to what legal document? The incorporation papers clearly state. I have read the incorporation papers, I interrupted. They contain forged signatures, including my grandmother's. The association has no legal authority over my property. The two men exchanged glances and began backing away. We will be in touch, the man with the clipboard said, and they hurried toward their car. Karen stood alone on my porch, her face white with rage. You cannot fight the entire board. We have lawyers. We have the backing of the county. You will lose everything. Actually, Karen, I think you are the one who is going to lose everything. That afternoon, I attended the monthly HOA board meeting. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building that had been built on land that I now knew belonged to me. About 20 homeowners were present, along with the 5 board members. Karen called the meeting to order and immediately began discussing my case. We have a property owner who is refusing to comply with community standards. Despite repeated warnings and mounting fines, he has chosen to challenge the authority of this board. I stood up. May I address the board? You may speak during the public comment period, Karen said dismissively. Actually, I think you need to hear what I have to say right now. I walked to the front of the room and placed a folder on the table. I have been doing research into the formation of this HOA and the property rights around the lake. What I discovered is very interesting. I opened the folder and pulled out copies of the original property deeds. This is the original plat map from 1947, when the lake community was first developed. As you can see, my grandmother's property included the entire lakefront and the community dock. Murmurs began spreading through the room. Karen's face had gone pale. Over the years, my grandmother sold parcels to other families, but she retained ownership of the dock and the lake access. The other families received easement rights to use the lake, but they never owned the land itself. I pulled out the next document. This is the incorporation paperwork for the Lakeside Homeowners Association. It claims authority over my grandmother's property and several others, but these property owners never consented to join the association. In fact, several of the signatures on these documents are forged. The room had gone completely silent. Every person was staring at the documents in my hands. But the most interesting discovery is this, I continued, pulling out the final document. This is the development plan filed by Lakeside Development LLC for a luxury resort complex. The plan requires control of the entire lakefront, including my property. And Lakeside Development LLC is owned by Robert Matthews, Karen's husband. Karen shot to her feet. This is a private meeting. You have no right to make these accusations. Actually, this is a public meeting of a legally incorporated association, and I am not making accusations. I am presenting facts. The room erupted in angry voices. Homeowners were demanding answers. Board members were shouting over each other. Karen was trying to restore order, but she had completely lost control. Just then, the door opened and Robert Matthews walked in. He was a big man with rough hands and a red face, and he looked furious. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "Your wife has been using the HOA to force people out so you can buy their properties cheap," I said calmly. "And now everyone knows about it." Robert stepped toward me, his hands clenched into fists. You need to shut your mouth right now. Or what? You will have me evicted from my own property. That is exactly what we are going to do, Karen said, her voice shaking with rage. You have 48 hours to vacate or we will have the sheriff remove you. I looked around the room at the shocked faces of the homeowners. Then I looked back at Karen and Robert. Go ahead and call the sheriff, I said. But you might want to explain to him how you plan to evict the legal owner of the property from land that he owns. I walked out of the meeting, leaving Karen and Robert to face the angry questions of their neighbors. But I knew this was not over. They were cornered now, and cornered people do desperate things. I just hoped I was ready for whatever they tried next. The next morning, I woke to find my car tires slashed and garbage scattered across my driveway. A note was taped to my door. Get out now or things will get worse. I called the county sheriff's office and filed a report. The deputy who responded was a young man named Officer Martinez, and he seemed genuinely concerned about the harassment I was experiencing. Have you had any direct threats? He asked. Yesterday, at the HOA meeting, Robert Matthews implied he would use force to remove me from my property. Martinez wrote everything down. I will drive by a few extra times this week, and I would suggest installing security cameras if you have not already. That afternoon, I met with James Sullivan, my grandmother's attorney. I brought all the evidence I had gathered, and he reviewed it carefully. This is even worse than I thought, he said finally. The HOA incorporation is completely invalid. The property claims are fraudulent, and this development scheme borders on criminal. What are my options? You have several. First, you can revoke all easement agreements immediately. That would cut off lake access for every property in the community. Second, you can file criminal charges for fraud and extortion. Third, you can sue for damages and have the HOA dissolved. I thought about the homeowners I had seen at the meeting. Most of them were innocent people who had been manipulated by Karen and Robert. They did not deserve to lose their lake access because of their leader's corruption. What if I offered a compromise? I asked. New easement agreements that protect everyone's access but remove Karen and Robert from power. Sullivan smiled. That would be very generous, and it would demonstrate that you are acting in good faith. But first, I want to make sure they understand exactly what they are dealing with. I spent the next day drafting a legal letter to the HOA board. It was detailed, professional, and devastating. I outlined every piece of evidence I had gathered. I documented the fraudulent incorporation, the forged signatures, the conflict of interest with the development company, and the systematic harassment of homeowners. But the most important part was the conclusion. I was revoking all easement agreements effective immediately. The community had 30 days to remove all boats, docks, and other structures from my property. Lake access would be terminated for all properties except mine. I hand-delivered copies to every homeowner in the community. By evening, my phone was ringing non-stop. The first call was from Mrs. Henderson. "Oh, honey, you have really stirred up a hornet's nest. Karen has been driving around all day, screaming at anyone who will listen." "What is she saying?" "That you are trying to destroy the community. That you are an outsider who does not understand how things work here. That the board will fight you in court." "What are the other homeowners saying?" "Most of them are furious at Karen. They are finally understanding that she has been using them to line her own pockets. There is talk of calling an emergency meeting to remove the entire board." The second call was from Robert Matthews. His voice was ice-cold and threatening. "You have no idea what you are dealing with," he said. I have connections in this county. I can make your life very difficult. Are you threatening me, Robert? I am telling you that you are making a big mistake. There are ways to make problems disappear around here. I hung up and immediately called Officer Martinez to report the threat. Then I called Sullivan to discuss increasing security at the property. But the most important call came that evening from Tom Bradley, one of the homeowners who had been at the meeting. He was a retired engineer who had lived on the lake for 10 years. I have been going through the HOA financial records, he said. The numbers do not add up. There are thousands of dollars in unexplained expenses, consulting fees to companies that do not exist, legal bills that are way too high for a small community association. Can you document it? I am working on it, but I think Karen and Robert have been embezzling money from the association for years. The easement situation is just the tip of the iceberg. What do you need from me? Time. Give me a week to put together a complete financial analysis. Then we can present it to the county prosecutor. I agreed to delay any legal action for 1 week, but I made it clear that the easement revocation would stand unless the entire board resigned and new leadership was elected. That night, I sat on my dock watching the sunset. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of the situation. Karen and Robert had spent years manipulating and intimidating people, but they had finally picked on someone who refused to be bullied. The lake was still and peaceful. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, patient and motionless, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I understood exactly how it felt. Karen and Robert thought they had all the power, but they were about to learn that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. The emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Saturday. Word had spread throughout the community about the financial irregularities, the forged incorporation documents, and the development scheme. Nearly every homeowner attended, and the tension in the room was electric. Karen tried to maintain control, but she was clearly rattled. Her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous energy and defensive responses to every question. We are here to address the unfounded accusations made by an outsider who is trying to destroy our community, she began. Tom Bradley stood up immediately. Before we go any further, I think everyone needs to see these financial records. He passed out copies of his analysis to everyone in the room. The numbers were damning. Over $40,000 in unexplained expenses over the past 3 years. Payments to consulting companies that existed only on paper. Legal fees that were 3 times higher than comparable HOA communities. Karen, can you explain where this money went? Tom asked. Karen's face flushed red. These records are confidential. You had no right to access them. Actually, as homeowners, we have every right to review the financial records of our association, and what we found suggests systematic embezzlement. The room erupted in angry voices. Homeowners were demanding answers. Board members were trying to distance themselves from Karen's decisions. The meeting was spiraling out of control. I stood up and waited for quiet. I have an offer for the community, I said. Everyone turned to look at me. Karen's eyes were filled with hatred, but she could not stop me from speaking. I am willing to negotiate new easement agreements that will protect everyone's lake access, but I have 3 conditions. First, the entire current board must resign immediately. Second, new leadership must be elected by the homeowners. Third, Karen and Robert Matthews must be permanently banned from any leadership role in the community. The room was silent for a moment. Then Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. I second that motion. This is not how parliamentary procedure works, Karen protested. Actually, Karen, parliamentary procedure requires that you follow the law, Tom Bradley said. And since the original incorporation documents were fraudulent, this association has no legal standing. One by one, homeowners began speaking up. They shared stories of harassment, excessive fines, and intimidation tactics. They talked about families who had been forced out of their homes. They demanded accountability from the board. The vote was unanimous. The entire board was removed from power, and a new interim leadership committee was elected. Karen was banned from any future involvement in community governance. But the real consequences were just beginning. The following Monday, I met with the county prosecutor to present all the evidence I had gathered. James Sullivan had prepared a comprehensive brief documenting the fraud, embezzlement, and extortion. "This is a strong case," the prosecutor said. "We will definitely be filing criminal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and possibly racketeering. What about the families who were forced out? They will have grounds for civil lawsuits. This could cost the Matthews family everything they have." Within a week, the local newspaper picked up the story. "Local HOA president charged with fraud" was the headline. The article detailed the entire scheme, from the forged incorporation documents to the development plans. Karen and Robert were arrested on a Tuesday morning. I watched from my dock as the police cars pulled up to their luxury home. The irony was not lost on me that they were being arrested on property that had been purchased with money stolen from the community. The criminal charges were extensive. Karen was charged with fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and abuse of power. Robert was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and making criminal threats. Both faced potential prison sentences. But the civil consequences were even more severe. The homeowners filed a class action lawsuit seeking damages for the harassment, illegal fines, and property devaluation caused by the fraudulent HOA. The families who had been forced out filed separate lawsuits for the losses they had suffered. The development company was also under investigation. The county planning office discovered that several permits had been obtained fraudulently, and the entire resort project was shut down pending a criminal investigation. Within 6 months, Karen and Robert Matthews lost everything. Their construction company went bankrupt. Their development projects were canceled. Their luxury home was forced on to pay legal fees and civil judgments. Karen was sentenced to 3 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement. Robert received 2 years for conspiracy and making criminal threats. Both were ordered to pay full restitution to the families they had harmed. The community began to heal under new leadership. The new board negotiated fair easement agreements that protected everyone's lake access while respecting property rights. The excessive fines were eliminated, and the harassment stopped. Several families who had been forced out were able to buy back their properties or receive compensation for their losses. The lake community became what it should have been from the beginning, a place where neighbors looked out for each other instead of preying on each other. I worked with the new board to draft reasonable community guidelines that preserved the rustic character of the lake while maintaining property values. The new rules were fair, transparent, and applied equally to everyone. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a letter from one of the families who had been forced out. They were able to buy back their old property and rebuild their cabin. Their children would grow up on the same lake where their grandparents had taught them to fish. That is what community really means. Not rules and regulations designed to enrich a few people at the expense of everyone else, but neighbors working together to preserve something beautiful for future generations. 6 months later, I was sitting on my dock at sunrise, holding my coffee cup and watching the mist rise from the water. The lake was peaceful again, but it was a different kind of peace than before. This was not the fragile quiet of someone trying to hide from the world. This was the calm confidence of someone who had faced a storm and emerged stronger. Karen and Robert Matthews were gone, serving their prison sentences and facing years of financial ruin. The community had elected new leadership that actually represented the interests of the homeowners. The harassment had stopped, the excessive fines had been eliminated, and families were moving back to the lake. I had become something I never expected, a community leader. Homeowners came to me with questions about property rights, disputes with contractors, and concerns about development pressures. I found myself mediating conflicts and helping neighbors work together to solve problems. The lake community was thriving in ways it never had under Karen's iron-fisted rule. Families were hosting barbecues on the beach. Children were learning to fish from the community dock. Neighbors were helping each other with dock repairs and garden maintenance. Mrs. Henderson had become my unofficial deputy, organizing community events and keeping everyone informed about local issues. She had lived through enough conflicts to understand the value of harmony, and she worked tirelessly to prevent the kinds of problems that had allowed Karen to seize power in the first place. I had also learned something important about myself. For years, I had used the lake cabin as an escape from the world, but fighting for the property had taught me that sometimes you cannot run away from problems. Sometimes you have to stand up and fight for what you believe in. The legal battles had cost me time and money, but they had given me something more valuable, a sense of purpose. I was no longer just someone who inherited a cabin. I was someone who had preserved a community and protected the rights of families who could not protect themselves. The lake itself seemed different now. The water was clearer, the wildlife more abundant. Whether that was real or just my imagination, I could not say. But I knew that the lake represented something pure and peaceful that was worth fighting for. I finished my coffee and walked back to the cabin. There was work to do. The new community board was meeting that afternoon to discuss plans for a shared workshop where homeowners could borrow tools and collaborate on projects. We were also planning a community garden where families could grow vegetables and children could learn about nature. These were the kinds of projects that built real community. Not rules and regulations imposed from above, but neighbors choosing to work together because they shared common values and common goals. As I opened the cabin door, I thought about my grandmother. She had loved this place because it represented freedom and peace. She had fought to preserve it for me, and I had fought to preserve it for the next generation. That is what family really means. Not just the people who share your blood, but the people who share your values and your commitment to protecting what matters most. The lake would endure, the community would thrive, and future generations would sit on this dock at sunrise, holding their coffee cups and watching the mist rise from the water, knowing that they were part of something beautiful and lasting.